Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, we're going to hear about the book, Not Sacred, Not Squaws, Indigenous Feminism Redefined by Cherry Smiley. And it's going to be discussed by Cherry Smiley and we hope Faye Blaney, who will jump onto the webinar in a bit. This Radical Feminist Perspectives is a series of webinars run by radical feminists whose voices have been cancelled or silenced in universities, schools, and the media. Frustrated we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. Thank you so much, Cherry, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about this book that that is a labor of love and emerged from, I guess you could say, anger and frustration, and the horrible things that I went through as a PhD student. So the book came out of my PhD dissertation in communication studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Cherry Smiley. I come from the Itlakatmuk or Thompson First Nation from the Nicola Valley in British Columbia, Canada, and also from the Dene or Navajo Nation from the southwestern United States. People, a lot of times women will ask me, how did I get involved? How did I become a feminist? What was my kind of journey here? How did I end up doing what I do? And I usually say that journey, I think, began when I was very, very young. So I grew up in Canada and in the United States, but we'll talk about Canada here because that's where I live. The statistics for Indigenous women in Canada are absolutely horrific. So very, very, very high rates of poverty, of disability, very high rates of male violence against women and girls, very high rates of addiction, suicide, being incarcerated in prison or jail. So Indigenous women are very much criminalized. Lower rates of completion of high school. Basically, Indigenous women and girls in Canada are facing a tremendous kind of tidal wave of forces that work to keep us poor, keep us homeless, keep us, suffering from the impacts of male violence, all of these things. So we hear these statistics a lot. We have also, in recent times, had a national inquiry into murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls in Canada. So that happened just a couple of years ago. And those rates are just startling and horrific. So many Indigenous women and girls in Canada have gone missing or been murdered, primarily by men, of course. And so we were able to get enough momentum going, Indigenous women and our allies, to push the government to hold a national inquiry on this issue. They did. It went horribly, and Indigenous women and girls continue to go missing and be murdered at incredibly high rates. So you hear these statistics all the time, and you hear these horror stories all the time. And so that's what I grew up in. Essentially, was in those horror stories. So that's I think that's where things started for me. I'm very lucky to have been raised by my maternal grandmother. She was my favorite person in the world. She passed away a couple years ago at 97 years old, and she was always somebody who she did what she wanted to do. And as a little example, I wrote a poem about her that opens the book. And so I remember talking to her about menstruation and what used to happen, traditionally with that. And she was like, oh, yeah, there was all these rules and, things you can do and things you can't do. And she said that one time she was so frustrated that she said, because apparently you're not supposed to walk behind elders when you're menstruating. And she said, well, if they don't want anybody to walk behind them, why don't they go sit in a corner? So she was very, she didn't accept cultural practices simply because, this is what was being, communicated to her as traditional. So she never taught us any of those menstruation taboos. So when I was younger, I thought, oh boy, maybe I'm not, native enough. As I grew up and I went to university and I was learning then about all of these things I'm not supposed to be doing. Oh my goodness, that I've been doing. And then I just realized, I came to learn how incredible my grandma was for, teaching us culture and teaching us tradition, but also teaching us not to get walked, not to just accept any kind of discrimination or any limitation because we were female, regardless of where that limitation was coming from. So I'm very lucky to have had her in my life, and I miss her every day, every minute. I'm very grateful to have had her teach me that and to have had her show me that in how she lived her life. So, so I wish you all could have met her. You would have loved her. So this book, Not Sacred, Not Squaws, Indigenous Feminism Redefined. So it was this PhD dissertation that I did, but the writing of the book started from when I was very, very young, right? And I began to question why things were happening. Why can't I do that? Encouraged by my grandma to constantly be asking questions. I grew up, I had a lot of issues in my 20s. I felt so alone. I developed really serious eating disorder and had all kinds of health issues going on because of what had happened and was happening to me and what was going on in my life at that time. So I ended up in a feminist theory class, and I was very lucky. This was many years ago. Very lucky to have a professor who was, using texts from Dale Spender and Audre Lorde and, these amazing feminists. So I'm very lucky that I was introduced to feminism in university, which I know many young women are not. They're actually denied access to feminist theory and feminist methodologies in universities. And what happened at that time was that when I began reading these texts, I learned a few things. The first thing I learned is that it wasn't my fault. And sometimes that can sound a little, it's like, oh, okay. But no, that saves women's lives, when they learn it's not their fault. I learned that other women were going through similar things. And that saves women's lives too, when we learn that we're not alone. And then I also was given words. I was given a vocabulary, a way to talk about what had happened. And I was given a frame that actually made sense to me with everything that had happened in my life and was happening in my life, it gave me a way to look at what was going on. And as I say in the book, feminism, and when I say feminism, I mean radical feminism, but I just call it feminism. It's the only theory and the only methodology that does that. It's the only theory and the only methodology that tells women it's not their fault, that centers women, doesn't forget about women. It's the only theory and methodology that does that. So any other kind of, there's a lot of pressure to kind of degender everything and, use Indigenous methodologies or, this constant pressure to forgive Indigenous men or ignore, the sexism and discrimination and male violence that happens from Indigenous men towards Indigenous women. So there's a lot of pressure to look at things, in a way that is about Indigenous peoples. And when we say peoples, they mean men. So it can be very hard and very lonely. I'm very lucky that I met a number of Indigenous women who have mentored me over the years. So I've been incredibly fortunate in that sense. I also did frontline work, so worked at a rape crisis center and a transition house for battered women and their children. Decided I wanted to make art, went to school to learn how to make art, which was its own pile of shit. I learned some great things, but, also really felt the patriarchy that's so deeply embedded in universities, whether they're, arts-based or not. And then decided, all right, I'm going to do a PhD, partly because I wanted, partly because I wanted, I knew that, the letters behind your name, like, I don't think that it's fair, and I don't think it's the way the world should be. But in our world now, that gives you some credibility. It's stupid, but it gives you some credibility. But I was really looking forward to having that time to read and think and learn and create something that I hoped would be useful to other women in the women's liberation movement. And I hope that's what I did. I hope that's, what has resulted from this. But I do know that I understand the barriers and the pushback, in universities to study something that's not going to challenge anything, right? To do research for research's sake. And I understand that it's, a lot easier to go that route. But I do think at the end of the day, being in university, it is a privilege. Having that time to think and write and research. And that as feminists, I do believe that we are obligated then to use that privilege to further women's liberation. So to make sure that when we're finished, this research benefits somebody other than myself. I think that that's so important. And I know that it's hard, but it is doable. It just makes things a lot more difficult. So I survived that process. I survived that process. I remember I said that once and in the university, and I had somebody, respond to me and say, is that maybe too strong of a word? And I was like, oh, no, I survived that process. And all the while I'm thinking, well, when people are misgendered, then they, and they're like, oh, I'm suicidal. Nobody's like, oh, is that too strong of a word, right? So it's only when women are talking about women's experiences, and women's feelings and talking about our realities, our material realities, that we're questioned on that, right? We're wrong, of course. So it was quite the journey. There was some amazing things that came out of that. So that's not to say that every woman that I met, that it was all bad. It wasn't. And I was really fortunate to be able to really get some clarity, I think, around my own politics and to really dig deep into research. So I'm very grateful for that, and for the support that I did get, in the university, that, I couldn't have done it without that, but was able to meet, academics and other women who think similar, and had similar politics. And so that was really great as well, to find those women. So, maybe, if Sheila or Joe have any questions, perhaps maybe that can help here a little bit.
Yeah. Now I haven't read the book, so I will ask you all about that and all the parts of it. That might be useful. Would you be able to do that? Yeah. Because let's just say to the audience that the woman who's supposed to be interviewing today has not come, but it is 2:00 in the morning for Cherry and for Faye. So maybe that's not entirely surprising. Can I just say that it's a great delight for me to talk to Cherry today, because I met her 15 years ago in Vancouver at a wonderful event organized by Vancouver Rape Relief on prostitution. And she was speaking on one of the panels. It went on for a fortnight, wonderful event. And I can really remember from that event, the thing that stuck in my mind absolutely more than anything else was material about the Trail of Tears, which is Indigenous Canadian women and what happened to them along the way as they were trafficked into prostitution. I think the assumption was that they were being trafficked into prostitution. I wonder if you could just go back to that moment and tell us something about that.
Sure. So, so the rates of Indigenous women and girls that are in prostitution are absolutely staggering. So Indigenous women and Indigenous girls are just grossly overrepresented in prostitution. And that's true across Canada. I would say that's probably true on a more global scale as well. So what happens in BC, so in a lot of the more kind of northern, more remote communities, there's very little public kind of transportation infrastructure. There's not as many health centers and things like that. So often women are having to go from their community and travel to a slightly larger one, perhaps for work, perhaps, for a doctor's appointment, for, childcare, whatever it is. And what that does, I think, in combination as well with the many, many man camps and the kind of, resource exploitation, just destruction of the land there. So you have all these camps of men who are getting paid way too much money and have basically free reign to do what they want. They're away from any, social, structures that they're kind of used to. They have no accountability. Basically, they do what they want. So you have that going on. You have this lack of ability for women to kind of get from one place to another when they need to get there. So there's a particular stretch of highway called the Highway of Tears in northern BC, and there have been so many women, some non-Indigenous women, but overwhelmingly Indigenous women and girls that have gone missing along that particular stretch of highway. And that's, you could say, is true across, the north, where women are needing to get somewhere, and, are being picked up and murdered, essentially, or picked up and raped or gang raped. So you also have really high rates of prostitution there as well, again, because you have these men with like tons of money, who are there and are, more than happy to exploit the inequality of women and girls in the North. And so what you have as well is you have all of these routes, a lot of them, like truck routes are one of the ways that women get to Vancouver, but you have this kind of network of highways where Indigenous women and girls are essentially trafficked, so brought down from the North into Vancouver. And then you have kind of circuits of highways and cities then where Indigenous women and girls and other women and girls as well are moved around within the province, sometimes into the States. You have Seattle there. Vancouver's a port city. So there's, a lot of activity going on in that sense. So it's a very, very dangerous reality for Indigenous women. And I can't kind of emphasize that enough. And I just want to say that so obviously, with the world has changed and there's a lot less travel happening. But before this, I used to travel quite a bit. And every time I got somewhere, wherever it was in the world, I had to make sure that I called my grandma, because my grandma would call me incessantly until I answered. But the reason that she did that was because she was so afraid that I wouldn't make it from point A to point B. And that's true still today with my sisters, with other Indigenous women. You're constantly checking in with one another because you don't actually know if you're going to make it from point A to point B.
Now, I seem to remember back then, it was being said that at least 1,000 women a year were being trafficked down this route, they thought, or disappearing along this route. I don't know what figures we have now. Does that seem possible? Or?
Yeah, definitely. There was definitely at that time, women were kind of trying to gather numbers and statistics and these kinds of things. So those have just exploded as we've gotten more information. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Force came out with their own statistics saying this is how many murdered and disappeared women there are according to our statistics. So that was in the thousands. So it's definitely not anecdotal. Like it's very obvious.
Yeah, and can I just say that it's very similar to the situation in Australia. Of course, as you say, everywhere Indigenous women exist, they are involved in prostitution. In Australia, when I lived there, which was up till 2015, there were stories about children, Aboriginal children, 8, 9 years old, who would go up to and beg from trucks at truck stops. They'd be taken onto the trucks and taken to other towns where they'd be dropped off and sexually used in between. And the number of women, Indigenous women in prostitution in Sydney was very high compared with other prostitution. So they're very interesting similarities. I don't know whether anybody's ever looked at that comparison, but I think that's very interesting, what you're saying. So if we just go now to your book, can you explain what it was about and why you wrote it?
I have a copy of it right here. So I'm very proud of this book, and I'm so grateful to Spinifex Press. Like, without them, I don't think anybody would have probably wanted to publish this book. So they've just been absolutely incredible. I'm just buy all of their books. They've just come out with the most incredible library of like radical feminist texts. It's incredible. So the book started out in one place, or I guess the dissertation, but we'll talk about it in terms of the book. I did write it didn't write it in an academic-y kind of way because I'm not an academic-y kind of woman. So, so I'm kind of the same in whatever kind of context I'm in. So I don't like to use, big fancy words and these kinds of things. So, so I wrote it as if I was kind of writing a book. Again, my poor grandma. When I was in doing an undergraduate degree, I would read my essays to her over the phone. What a generous grandma. And if she understood the essay, then I would know that I was being clear. And if she didn't, then I'm like, oh shit, I'm not being clear enough in my writing. I better go back and fix that. So I wanted to make sure that as many women as possible would be able to understand what I was saying. So it started out being about prostitution and the prostitution of Indigenous women and girls as a process of colonization. So that was kind of what I was looking at the beginning. So I interviewed women in prostitution, Indigenous survivors of prostitution in Canada. I spoke with women in New Zealand and in Australia. I was in New Zealand for almost 4 months. And so came in with this, these ideas of what would happen. And what happened was about halfway through, I realized I was doing everything upside down. So basically what I had to do was, I was like, wait a minute. So if I'm looking at the prostitution of Indigenous women and girls as a process of colonization, what do I mean by colonization? Like, what is that? So I looked it up. I think Indigenous women, we know it in our lives. We know it when we see it. But in terms of kind of definitions and this kind of thing. So, and as I was doing that, I was like, wait a minute. Who came up with these definitions? I was like, oh, men. That's right. Men came up with the definition of colonization. And with the kind of popular understanding of colonization that we have in Canada, doesn't take into account Indigenous women in any kind of meaningful way, right? So I was also looking at, I had a women's committee that was outside of the university. And one of the things that they really wanted me to look at and to talk about was the male violence that happens, or the male violence from Indigenous men towards Indigenous women. And that is one of the hardest things to talk about for a number of different reasons. And Indigenous women are just, it's hard enough to talk about any kind of male violence that's been done to you. But when it's from, a man in your own family and in your own community, from your own nation, it's like a whole other level of silencing. So, I had to, oops, my watch is talking to me. So I had to come up. So I was like, okay, I need to look at this colonization. So then I thought, okay, so what would a definition of colonization look like if it did included women, or it came from a women's perspective, or a feminist perspective. So I decided then to redefine colonization as primarily a sex-based process that also, has to do with race, but is primarily a sex-based process. And so I was building on, work from Robin Morgan and other women who had begun to theorize this. So that wasn't new in that sense. But in terms of accounting for male violence from Indigenous men and for Indigenous women's material realities, I had to build on those beginnings. So I basically, redefined colonization as primarily a sex-based practice, and then looked at how prostitution kind of fit into that. So the most kind of succinct way, I think. So I was like having like a mental crisis, because I was sure, and then I was like, oh, wait a minute, I have to reevaluate my own what I know and my own politics and my own, what I've been saying. I really need to take a look at this, and I have to consider that maybe I'm wrong. It turned out I was. So the most succinct way that I think about the distinction is back. So when Sheila and I were at this event together, I remember, and for many years, I would say that colonization was imposed on Indigenous communities. Now I say that colonization was, so I would say patriarchy was imposed on Indigenous communities in a process of colonization, right? So patriarchy was imposed on Indigenous communities is what I would say. Now I say patriarchy was adopted by Indigenous men. And so it's a perspective that does take into account male violence from Indigenous men, how that process works, how Indigenous men have colluded with non-Indigenous men to kind of create these conditions where an Indigenous women and girls, whether they're in their First Nations community, whether they're in the city, on the reserve, in a small town, whatever, are facing very, very similar threats, to our lives. And so it's, so I did realize too that, because I was like, oh boy, I'm like, oh, nobody's going to be happy with this book now, which is, it's fine. I think if you piss off the right people, then you're doing a good job, right, Sheila? Mm-hmm. So yeah, so that's kind of the major, one of the major changes, I guess, or deepening, but probably deepening, not so much a change of politics, a deepening of politics. And one of the other things that shifted for me in the course of the book as well was looking at the ways in Canada that Indigenous women are separated from non-Indigenous women. So, for example, in the national inquiry that we had about murdered and disappeared Indigenous women, there was, all these people doing the inquiry, and they did this huge literature review, and they did not look at one single feminist report, feminist piece of literature that looked at male violence against women and girls. So that whole body of knowledge that feminists have come up with and have learned and have articulated was totally ignored. So they were treating Indigenous women as if we are completely different, and that, male violence against Indigenous women is completely different from male violence against non-Indigenous women and girls. And what a disservice. So the ways that I think about that now are that I think about it in terms of particularities. So male violence against Indigenous women and girls happens in particular ways. So there are differences in terms of, context and history and all these kinds of things, but that fundamentally the male violence is the same. But there are, specificities and particularities that pertain to Indigenous women and to other groups of women as well. But just making sure that we are looking at those commonalities, and building from there. Because I just think that was such a slap in the face, to have a national inquiry on male violence against women and girls, Indigenous or not, and to totally dismiss all feminist theorizing research, on the matter was just, it was essentially, I think, a slap in the face, because we know a lot already. We don't need to, reinvent the wheel here. We just need to further our thinking and further our action, right?
Yes. Now, I think one of the similarities between Indigenous women, it's not exactly the same in the history of other women, is that the connection between the use of Indigenous women in the process of development, which I wrote about in my book, Industrial Vagina. And I was looking at the use of Indigenous women in Papua New Guinea when they were taken to the mining camps and prostituted. And I was looking at what happened in Australia, which is where Indigenous women in the 19th and 20th century were being exchanged between men for bottles of whiskey, apparently. I found details about that in an archive, in a women's archive. That was amazing to find that way back when. And what was happening was that Indigenous women were being used in camps for in extractive industries. That was happening in Papua New Guinea, happening in Australia. And I'm assuming it must have been happening in Canada as well.
And it's still happening in Canada.
It is still happening in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in Australia now there is a pattern in which women are taken from one side of the country to the other to be used in hotel rooms around mining camps. But I'm not exactly sure who is being used. Also, Japanese girls would be trained in Singapore, sent over to the mining camps. This was happening in the late 19th century in Australia. So there's a very important history about how Indigenous women, destruction and exploitation of Indigenous women was crucial to the whole process of development and the whole process of the build-up of the wealth of these nations, which I find really, really interesting. I'm assuming that is the same as what happened in Canada.
Yes, it's very, very similar. So one of the things that I learned that I didn't know previous was that the very first prostitution legislation that came about in Canada was in the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that only applies to a particular group of First Nations people, so status First Nations people. It's all very complicated how that happens, but so the initial legislation governing prostitution only applied to Indigenous peoples, and really it only applied to Indigenous women and girls. And the definition of prostitution in the Indian Act in the beginning was so broad that basically any Indigenous woman or girl could be criminalized for being in prostitution, whether she actually was or not. One of the pieces of literature that I used and that I really enjoyed was a book by Sarah Carter. She's a feminist historian in Canada, and she her book. Hold on, I'm just going to find the name of it. She has an incredible analysis. So it's called Capturing Women, the Manipulation of Cultural Imagery in Canada's Prairie West. See, so she has this incredible analysis that looks at how Indigenous women, but also how white women were used in not just the kind of exploitation of the land, but in the process of nation building into what became Canada. And so she looks at the ways essentially that Indigenous women were constructed, and we still are today, as, savage, as sex crazy, violent, wild, all of these were just all of these things that are not true about us as women. So Indigenous women have been and continue to be constructed in that way. And even I think Indigenous women, it doesn't matter how old you are, how young you are. If you are an Indigenous woman and you're out there walking on the street, the assumption is going to be that you are available for prostitution, that you are available to be bought. And it doesn't matter. You could be 90 years old out there, and there's still going to be that assumption.
Yes. And the children can be very young, as in New Zealand, there are 8-9-year-old Indigenous girls being used in prostitution, particularly, of course, since the decriminalization and real construction of the prostitution industry.
So very, very young girls, and with gangs and stuff like that, we see here as well. Even younger than that. You're looking at 5-6 years old, potentially even younger than that. And high rates of incest within Indigenous families. So high rates of incest and very high rates of sexual assault of girls So you're getting set up for prostitution. You're getting kind of set up by Indigenous men and then knocked down by white men.
Yeah,
but
very similar in Australia, very similar.
Yes. So Sarah Carter was talking about this construction of Indigenous women, we're just sex crazy, these were all lies that were created by men. And then she talked about the construction of white women. And so this idea of white women as being fragile, as being in need of protection, as kind of like the mothers of the nation, or just needing to just being very, very fragile and needing to be protected. And the way that they spun this was essentially, these white women need to be protected from these crazy ass violent squaws. So we're going to adopt all of this legislation that basically puts Indigenous women and men on reserves and doesn't let them leave. So, and then, started adopting all of this kind of legislation that restricted our movement, that took away land, took away, anything kind of, anything and everything. And so in that process, so they were using white women, right, as this reasoning or excuse to really come down hard on Indigenous women and Indigenous men. But the reality of the situation, of course, was that Indigenous women were not like sex crazy, violent savages, and white women were not fragile, in need of protection. The reality at that time was that, Indigenous women were women with all of our complexities and, realities, and that white women at that time who had been brought to Canada, so they didn't have any choice in the matter, were like digging ditches and building houses and, had to be doing had to survive in this environment that they were not used to, and that could be very harsh. So they were not, these fragile little flowers in need of protection. And so Carter talks about, that, but then goes on to say then that these kind of constructions were how they were used to build Canada, the nation of Canada, but also how they were used to separate white women from Indigenous women, so that we weren't able to, come together and build solidarity and these kinds of things.
Yes, and they built Canada, as they did all these other countries,
Mm-hmm.
in a very firm financial way. I mean, the profits came from the way that these women were used very much. Now, if you just go on a bit with your book. So you interviewed women from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. How did you organize the material from your interviews? That is, sort of, what were the themes and the chapters? Because unfortunately, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on that. So can you explain that to us?
Yeah. So I spoke with a lot of women. So I spoke with women who had survived prostitution. I spoke with women who were experts on prostitution. And I spoke with, so those are kind of the two groups of women essentially that I was speaking with. So I was able to get and of course, many women were both. So I was able to get a really great, it's like 2 a.m, sorry, a great cross section of women, in this. And so what I did was, so what I did in Canada, so it was much more difficult in New Zealand and Australia. And I actually didn't formally speak with survivors of prostitution in New Zealand. And I didn't do that because I think it's unethical at this point in time. If I were to go there and speak with a woman who was in prostitution or who had been in prostitution, and she's ripping open her wounds and telling me all of these horrific things that has been done to her, that is being done to her, and then I just like fuck off back home and leave her there with no connection to services or anybody that can actually help her in that moment, I'm like, that's not right. So if I'm going to do that, I feel like I would need to then be stuck with that woman, and follow through and help her out. Because I just think that to kind of parachute into somewhere and ask women to tell you the most horrific things that have been the most horrific and humiliating and degrading things that have been done to them, and then just like leave them standing there, is just unethical. So because there are no services that help women to get out in New Zealand, I just was like, I can't do this here. There is in Canada. So that's kind of how I found women. And this was my women's committee made sure that we had a certain criteria, that women had been out for at least 2 years, that they were connected to some type of service or community service or social service that was providing them with support. Again, so I'm not just like ripping open wounds and running away. So
what did you find out though from New Zealand?
So I found out in a lot of ways, I guess I found out it confirmed a lot of what I already knew, which is these that the male violence in Indigenous women's lives basically starts from the time you're born and goes until you die, essentially. So we're not looking at kind of isolated incidences of male violence that might happen once or twice over the course of your lifetime. It's consistent, and it is absolutely degrading. So you have that additional layer of racism. What else I learned? So there was some women that I spoke to that would be considered, high class escorts, who were Indigenous women. And so they would often try to present themselves as, Italian or some other kind of, ethnicity, so that because they knew the risks. But I think that was really important, because the majority, overwhelming studies that have been done on prostitution in Canada have been done on prostitution that happens on the street in major centers. So we haven't looked very much at what goes on reserves in rural or remote communities, but we also haven't looked at the brothels and escort services. So the overrepresentation is likely much, much higher than we actually think it is. And so that was, I knew that to be true already, but it definitely confirmed that it's not, women are in prostitution in all kinds of ways. One of the other things that I learned as well, and I was speaking to this one woman, and she's like, there's so many women, so many of our women are in prostitution. And she's like, maybe they've been in for a week, or maybe they go in for a year, maybe they turn, 1 trick or 10 tricks or 500 tricks. But she's like, there's a lot of women out there who are never going to speak to a researcher. They're never going to they're never going to tell anybody what happened to them, because of the shame, because of the repercussions, all of these kinds of things. So she's like, you're going to have all of these, these women who are just never going to say that to anybody else. So in that sense, too, the overrepresentation is likely much, much higher, again, than we think that it is. And so, definitely that got me kind of, in that, all the women who have been killed in that process, whether directly or indirectly, killed, either while in prostitution or afterwards, who aren't going to be able to speak either because they're dead, they've been murdered, or they've gone missing. So it was a lot of kind of confirmed in a lot of ways what I knew, and just these stories were just, it was so intense. It was definitely a lot of male violence within the family. A lot of women had been involved in or had been taken away and placed into foster care or some kind of child protection services. So that was very, very common. A lot of poverty. What else was common was a lot of women that I spoke to, either their mothers or their grandmothers, or sometimes their grandmothers, were in prostitution, or their sisters and their cousins. So it was always something that was around, you know?
Yeah.
S-
Can I just ask? I think when I was living in Australia, it was very, very difficult for Indigenous women and feminists working on violence against women to speak about violence from Indigenous men to Indigenous women, which is something you've been talking about. And I always assumed it was because the left in Australia in particular had created a kind of noble savage myth, which meant that it simply wasn't possible to question the fact that Indigenous men would, in a sense, be the best of men, in fact. And I wonder, I think that does happen in terms of Maori culture in New Zealand. And I wonder whether it's happening in Canada too, because it makes it very, very difficult to talk about the sort of things that you're talking about. They're just completely banned. You cannot dent that image somehow.
It is, and there's a lot of factors. I do think definitely that kind of the noble savage, this idea that people want to be as anti-racist as possible. They don't care about women, right? So it's much easier to be anti-racist than it is to be pro-woman, right? So they'll be worried about being called racist if they're holding Indigenous men to account. Some of the other reasons why as well are, so sometimes what happens, or oftentimes what happens in Indigenous communities, is if there is, a man is battering, for example, his wife, the woman in his home, and she raises the alarm and she tells somebody, often what ends up happening is they remove the children. So instead of removing him or criminalizing him, the children are then removed. And so women are afraid because they don't want to lose their children. So they won't speak up. We've heard, lots of statistics about Indigenous men who are, they face harsher penalties in the criminal justice system, which is true, but I don't really care about that. Like, that's their fight. I mean, if his fight is to make sure that he gets the same prison sentence, as a white guy for raping a woman, like, I don't care about that. But that is in the back of a lot of women's minds, right? They're going to be blamed then, for whatever happens to him, which is common, I think, for all women, but particularly for women in Indigenous communities and other racialized communities as well, knowing that you are going to be, opening this up, and you're going to get blamed essentially for whatever it ends up happening to him, makes it very, very difficult. You also, in Indigenous communities, there is a lot of, there's a sense that, I don't want to say loyalty, but there's a lot of family interconnection that happens too, right? So sometimes it gets very difficult, depending on, what family he's in, what family he comes from, who he's related to, all of these kinds of power dynamics that play out. But definitely among, the very kind of, I think, vocal people in Canada, there's this idea that Indigenous men are just, they're victims too. And they very much like to, that's why they had this kind of degendered definition of colonization, right? So they could be victims as well. It's not their fault that they're raping or battering women, right? It's because they were colonized. So
I remember one case in Australia where on Indigenous lands, a woman was being beaten by her partner, but the refuge which was on those lands was run by the big man's family, and there are always men on the reserves who actually run pretty much everything. And so in the end, she couldn't get away. Also, she wasn't allowed to drive the cars. Women weren't allowed to drive the cars. So she killed him, which was, the end result.
Her only way out, she thought,
way out. So it's very interesting to hear what you're saying and make these comparisons across countries. We are actually moving towards the end of this really, really interesting webinar.
My goodness, we are.
We are. I wonder, is there anything in particular you'd like to say at this point? Because I'm surely going to ask you about women's studies online if you don't. So is there anything else you want to say here?
Just thank you to Spinifex Press again for their incredible and very, very brave work. And Also, to you, Sheila, and Joe as well, for the work that you do, and for all the women that are here.
Well, it's absolutely delightful for me to talk to you. Can I just ask you now about Women's Studies Online? Because I think a lot of women might not know about it. So the situation is that Cherry, assuming that she would not get a reasonable job in academia because of her politics.
Oh no, it was demonstrated to me a few times. That they're like, no, we're not hiring you because of this. Yeah.
So she set up something very splendid, which is Women's Studies Online. That's great. I mean, I would advise women on here to have a look at Women's Studies Online. I've asked for the link in the chat. I'm not sure if anybody's going to put it in for me, so that they can find out what's being offered, because women can take it from anywhere. That's the situation, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, everybody can sign up. So we're relatively new, so we're working out some, we're always self-reflecting to make it better. So so we definitely welcome women to join, and and just let us know what's useful and what's not. And
at a time now when women's studies has pretty much gone, to have you there doing this is pretty wonderful. So apart from all of that, thanks very, very much for doing this webinar, which has been absolutely terrific.
Thank you so much. Now I'm like super awake. That was such a great discussion. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much indeed.